Now this is a topic that really gets me going, the whole question of activism. I have a list, the length of my arm, of questions that I actually care about. So I'm just going to pick one from among many, and if you folks want to interject with your comments, please do. About 8 years ago, Greenpeace published or set up this site called ExxonMobil Logs. And it had one of the most interesting things. For me, it was kind of shocking. I've had many naive moments in my life. Because on this site, they had a memo that was leaked from Lee Raymond, who was then the CEO of ExxonMobil, in which he said to a bunch of climate change deniers, here's a check for several $1 million. If you can sow doubt about the existence of climate change, then we won. And so here we have a panel whose lives are, well, if not entirely devoted to, feature the whole issue of perception. The question that I've been wondering about ever since I saw that leaked memo is, if the debate turns into something that's about perception instead of fact and empirical truth, have we lost? So it's like, because the debate's about the wrong thing, right? We're not actually talking about the underlying problem. We're just a series of conflicting perceptions. I'm hoping this is a straw man, but do you have any comments?
The debate is a straw man. I never know if I'm using that term correctly. So let me
well, I'm hoping it's easy to
clarify.
knock down my argument, but I fear my heart
It's a straw
hearts.
man. What does that mean? Why are we debating? Like, why are we getting sucked into that? You know, so much of our energy has gone toward that rather than marshaling a visible and kind of captivating and seductive movements of people who are just moving forward. And that's where compelling storytelling, the tools of art and culture, the persuasion industries can absolutely be in service. And there's something that Steve Duncombe at NYU in the Media Culture Studies Department talks about, and that's the ethical spectacle. So it used to be that, you know, we're the most media literate generation of Chomsky readers who are trained to deconstruct. You know, we are very critical of media, right? And now what we have, like this context of communicative capitalism where there's so much static to noise that it's so hard to surface a narrative and have it gain traction, unless you have multi-million dollars to have the message disciplines that was referenced at the beginning of the day. So the ethical spectacle is, you know, where the left has been like, well, let's peer behind the curtain, Dorothy, and see who's pulling the strings, and it's all about deconstruction. You know, in the meantime, we're the wet blanket, and the right is constructing narratives, but they're not based on truth. So why aren't we constructing narratives that are based on truth, that are compelling? You know, so advertising, you know, he gives the example of a McDonald's ad where there's a dad and his kid and a sunset at the end of a beautiful day where they've been to the playground and they've done this and that, and you know, and they're eating a burger, and you know, you don't see any McDonald's branding anywhere, but it's at the end brought to you by McDonald's, as if like the company is bringing you time off to share with your kid and XYZ. But that, you know, you could imagine kind of the same ad for the labor movement.
Okay. But what about things like culture jamming, recontextualization, humor? Where do they fit into sort of the environmentalist program?
Well, the example you just brought up of Exxon going to people and saying, let's sow doubt, and
Yeah.
your question, have they won? I mean, yeah, they won. I mean, they definitely won that. You know, there's a debate where there shouldn't be a debate. And that's, you know, that's clearly trickery, right? That's a form of culture jamming just from the dark side. It's definitely a hoax. It's a very cleverly constructed hoax. It's built, you know, by very clever means. And yeah, I think building great narratives that communicate truth instead of hamburgers or global warming doubt is really important. And there's also a place for using the same kind of trickery that the other side uses and uses on a massive scale but using it to expose truth instead of to sow lies. And basically what we did with the shell, with the shell example was use the techniques of the other side that they use in a very widespread way, but they never revealed it as a hoax. And we revealed at least twice that it was a hoax. It didn't do any good. People still believed it, but we did actually come out and say this is why we did it, this is the point, and this is the truth here that we're pointing to, which the other side can't possibly do. They can never reveal because they're not pointing to the truth. They're trying to sow falsehoods. So I think we just have to learn from them.
I would just also say that I think that the more that literacy, media visual literacy can be paired with the democratization and availability of the tools, that truths will inherently be there and or be manipulated more. And I know that that's obvious, but I think that one of the things that I feel like is missing from a lot of the action-oriented, like moving up the ladder of engagement, action-oriented campaigns is meaningful ways of deep listening and storytelling married together. So there's often, you know, a sexy, compelling video or a strong visual campaign. All those things are so important. But I think that the methods of participation alongside action that encourage personal narrative and creativity, I don't think that has been cracked yet. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
I'm just curious on how you view the role of the traditional media. Because it sounds like a lot of what you're doing is to try to use social media to sort of look around at the traditional media, as the traditional media as an enemy or as a bought enemy in one way. But is there other? But they still are powerful. How does one sort of co-opt or get them involved in what you're doing?
Well, I mean, the main thing we do is
we treat the media as an actor in our plays that we found, if you want to use theater as a metaphor. So they're very much, we play to the traditional media. So that example, the shell fail example, was an example of like a Twitter storm, was an example of something that really did rely on the tendency to share before fact checking that social media has. So that was a specific tactic in that case. Some other examples of yes men actions really rely completely on the 24-hour news cycle and rely completely on the mechanisms of disseminating news by sending out press releases, for instance, that look like they were from Shell or Dow Chemical or what have you.
So one of the reason I was asking is it seems like one of the ways to really piss off the traditional media is to get them in a position where they're reporting something that then is discovered is not true, and then if they weren't an enemy in the first place, you created it. I'm wondering, and I don't know what that dynamic is like, or if that's even true. I don't know.
I don't think so. I mean, the way we see what we do, including the shell action, it used social media, but it really was ultimately for the traditional media.
Yep.
And the whole social media storm may have reached 1 million people, I don't know, but the traditional media that came out of that and that reported on that, many articles, TV, CNN, et cetera, reached probably many more, I think. So the way we see our work is essentially giving excuses to traditional journalists to cover important issues, more than they would ordinarily. And there are often issues that are already being covered, but we just give them a little bit of joke material to add into the mix that gives them an excuse to cover it. But to address your point about them being mad, when we fool them, strangely, that doesn't seem to happen much. I mean, maybe individual journalists are, but by and large, journalists continue to like the yes men for some reason. And I'm not reporting this firsthand. George Monbiot told me, like, it had puzzled him, like, we fool journalists and yet they keep reporting on us in a very positive way, and he's talked to many of them, and he said, yeah, they all seem to like him. I don't know why, but I think maybe it's because what we do is essentially collaborative with them. You know, they understand we're only fooling them in order to generate news that they want to report. They go into journalism for a purpose, to report important things, and they find themselves in this disgusting system that doesn't let them do that often unless they have a joke or an extremely serious story something violent or funny. And so I think they understand that even when we're fooling them, it's kind of in good humor. We're not attacking them. We're not trying to destroy them. We're trying to, give them material, give at least the rest of the journalists, and sometimes the journalists themselves that we fool, material to cover the issue. And often the journalists that have been fooled by things we do go and write a second article saying, I was fooled, so have many people been, and here's the story, and here's why it was done. So.
Right.
I just, I don't know if it's totally useful to draw this line between social media and mainstream media. I feel like it's a media ecosystem, and there's a trickle down and kind of trickle up thing that happens. It's bidirectional. On our end at Not an Alternative, a big piece of what we do is visual communications, and we do it as a fee-for-service thing with nonprofits and labor unions and so on. And our interest there is kind of developing a visual language that can iterate and a kind of open source collaboratively developed visual language that can function as connective tissue between different issues, different constituencies, different cities, so that our work is legible as a movement. And you actually see that then play out in photos where mainstream media has massive distribution channels and reach massive audiences. So we have to be thinking about how to disseminate via social media and mainstream media.
Just to add to that, I'm also part of Not an Alternative, just to add to our strategy. I mean, it's kind of what Jocker was saying about how there's people on the inside who are part of mainstream media who already want to tell those stories. And it's a matter of essentially trying to affect the way those mainstream institutions work, not positioning ourselves outside as only doing the subversive tactics and then calling it a joke, because it's not actually a joke, it's quite serious. And the serious part comes in when it enables those people on the inside to spread that, even when they know it, to get on board and say, actually, I'm excited that this happened. I'm glad I was able to report on this, even though maybe I didn't know it about it at the time.
Yes.
What do you see? So much of the environmental messaging, I think it's starting to change, but so much of the environmental messaging is, to date has been doom and gloom. And what do you see as kind of the play between doom and gloom? Like, obviously you guys on employee paper, do you find it more effective? Are there ways to measure that? Like, how important is the use of humor?
Well, humor's I think it's good for journalists. It's a way to get, it's fun to write about something splashing in an old lady's face rather than more statistics, But it is, doom and gloom is it is doom and it is gloom. We need to get that across in a clear way. We shouldn't palliate that. The problem would be if humor said, oh, it's no big deal. But as long as it's saying, no, this is a really, really huge deal, and why don't you laugh about the fact that you're all going to die? That black humor has a place. And it doesn't, I don't think it necessarily diffuses a feeling of urgency. It might do the opposite. It doesn't necessarily let off steam. It might actually give people a little more power. It's unclear. But, there's some people who, in the USSR, who said that Brezhnev was brought down, in Russia, who said that Brezhnev was brought down by jokes, that people couldn't say the word Brezhnev without laughing, and that was, it's an exaggeration, but it's a part of it. And Mubarak, of course, humor was huge in the Egyptian revolution. So laughing at the oil companies that are killing us and at the stuff that they do. If we could say ExxonMobil and laugh hysterically because it's just so stupid and their lies are so egregious, and that might be powerful.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think that looking at a lot of different organizations and their messaging, I feel like it's, again, there's so many different constitutions. Thank you. Communities, individuals, languages, visual and otherwise, that you kind of need all of the above. And that's one thing that something like transmedia allows is the multiple points of entry. But many of these organizations, like look at Green for All, they'll present something that's like 2 talking heads. They'll present, a photo series of items in the green economy showing, focusing really on people of color in XY neighborhood, or, they'll do something that's a little bit more analytical and policy oriented than a song and a cartoon, and a lot of different organizations that have the capacity and put the focus on this kind of media and storytelling will do that because it's all needed. Like, you need an animation, you need an infographic, you need, obviously not every organization can do that, but if you can, and I think that also, ideally that comes out of a co-design process with your communities, and that's something that's, co-created so that everyone's going to have the expertise in all the forms of media, but they are going to have some expertise in some area of the message or media or tools or whatever else.
In the last 6 months or so, maybe it's my perception, but it seems like the mainstream media anyway has paid a lot more attention, quote unquote, to the Koch brothers. And that's obviously something that's almost anathema to them because they've always operated in the background and strategized the big picture. Is there any experiences, especially for yes men, in terms of whether it's use of humor or use of something to bring out to the everyday person what's behind the Koch brothers, rather than a smaller minority of people that really know what's happening, to bring it out to everyday, how they impact everyday life, directly or indirectly?
I can say one thing. I mentioned at the beginning the Natural History Museum project that we're really just at the beginning stages doing research now, but David Koch sits on the board of the American Museum of Natural History. He's a big donor. The 2009 Climate Change exhibition bore his name. And as artists, we are concerned about the increasing corporate consolidation of sponsorship of our cultural institutions. It's kind of a side door way in to influence the zeitgeist and behavior, right? Quite a powerful, its effects are hard to measure, but very powerful strategy. So for us, our goal is to use the aesthetics and presentation of pedagogical forms of the museum, not as a parody, but for the already initiated, but rather in a sincere way that will appeal to people who love natural history museums and create space for champions on the inside. So we'll be representing their 2009 climate change exhibition, but including information that's excluded, such as climate denialism or obstructionism as a factor in the history of climate change, and in the museum itself, for instance. But doing it in a fashion where we can tell these stories, but really we can appeal to the general public, recognizing that these massive influential cultural institutions define the aesthetics for the truth of nature, very authoritative, legitimizing aesthetics that trickle down into children's books and science texts and other museums alike. So that's one strategy we're employing.
And quite telling, the Koch brothers are the ones that have funded the dinosaur section of the America.
And the Hall of Man, which interestingly in the DC Smithsonian is all about evolution, and it was a head scratcher for me. Like, why does he care so much about natural history and evolution? And it just kind of clicked into place when I thought about it. You walk into that exhibit, and it's a timeline. It's the first thing you see is a timeline of the fluctuations of climate throughout the planet's history, and correlating them with moments of evolution and technological gains.
I have the pleasure of hosting the final session for the afternoon, and I think really just asking some summary questions. And I'm hoping to do the same of the audience and to get some Q&A going with you as well and your perspective. I've been here for I think the better part of the day, so I've got some sense of the conversation that's going on here. But I'm probably the person here who knows least about environmental activism generally, although I can claim some expertise on the digital media front. So I'm largely going to leave it to our panelists to say a few words. We have David Miller, who I think you've seen, President and CEO of World Wildlife Federation of Canada. Micah, who many of you know, you've seen wandering around today, Director of Innovation and Entrepreneurship. He fed you lunch, Urban Future Lab. Rich Winter, Professor of Environmental Psychology, Department of Technology, Culture, and Society at NYU Poly. And then Scott Liffen, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Director of Information Technology for World Wildlife Foundation as well. So this session is meant to be the summary. And I guess the first question I want to sort of pose to our panelists is, are you optimistic or pessimistic about this issue? And as a result, perhaps, of today's conversation, where are you on the spectrum of things?
So, I'm both. This probably isn't the answer you were seeking.
Yeah.
You know, the yes men are clear. The former politicians are fuzzy. Can I, just before I answer the question, can I just quickly say something about Canada, because there was a slide about Canada earlier. And I do want to point out that as the head of an environmental not-for-profit, I am not allowed to have political opinions, and the Canadian government, in a time of austerity, recently spent $5 million to audit environmental charities on their political activity. I thought it's an interesting thing people needed to know, which limits our ability sometimes to speak about politics. But B, the vast majority of Canadians don't support our government's position as climate change deniers, as supporters of massive expansion of the Alberta tar sands, and as a government that doesn't have any plan to combat climate change. So I just wanted to defend Canadians to people, because somebody put a slide up. We're actually nice people. So
Even though you have no political opinions.
even though I have no political opinions, that's about Canadians, not about partisan political matters. Second thing, the reason I have hope and optimism, and not as much as I'd like to, but I have some hope and optimism, is based on, if you take all of the presentations today, I thought it really summarized where we are. And the scary part of where we are is the right, and I use that very, very loosely, is incredibly organized. The day after the Lac-Mégantic tragedy, and this was an unbelievable tragedy, right? An entire downtown blew up. And people who were sitting out having a beer were all just decimated because the trains were carrying liquids that they shouldn't carry because they're too dangerous for the equipment, and secondly, because the railways had lobbied for less regulation and didn't have a brakeman. So completely preventable tragedy. The day after that, in the Wall Street Journal, the National Post in Canada, the Globe and Mail, and other papers across the world, including England, had virtually the same editorial about this is why we need to build pipelines. It was unbelievable. 24 hours later, in the face of that kind of tragedy. So the organized pro-climate change group is very ruthless and efficient, and honors what was said at the beginning of today, which I agree with completely. You've got to have clear, simple messages repeated by a trusted source. We don't have the money or organizational skills to do that, and those who are working for people on the planet, but what we do have is people. And the reason I'm optimistic is some of the things we heard this afternoon about engaging people directly in their neighborhoods and communities, particularly by empowering them to tell their own stories. And we can do that with humor, we can do that face-to-face, you know, we can do that with trendy, nippy, zippy little campaigns like the Dog Do Picker-Uppers in California, which I thought was brilliant. And we can also do that by empowering people through digital media to literally tell those stories. And when I was mayor of Toronto, we had two programs, one with Nikon and one with Canon, in which we gave state-of-the-art digital cameras to young people in some of our lowest income neighborhoods, neighborhoods that other people would always talk about as the place you don't want to go, and let them tell their stories. We didn't tell them what the stories were. They told their own stories, and we facilitated it and gave it attention. And I think that's actually a great strength of the environmental movement broadly writ, because we really represent people's deepest held values of connecting with nature. And if we can find ways to use these modern tools to actually empower people to tell their own stories about why these environmental issues, climate change or anything else, matter to them, I think we can achieve a huge victory. But it has to be done differently. And besides, the left never gets as organized as the right, so we shouldn't bother trying.
So more optimistic or more pessimistic? Which one?
Well, that's sort of a yes or no question, isn't it? I'm actually optimistic because I think in the end the people win. And that's really what we have on our side is the people.
Michael.
I just want to say how ironic that David's glass is literally just about half full. I don't know if he planned it, that's right. So I'm a native New Yorker, so I'm a little bit jaded, but I think that does not prevent me from being an optimist, but that's a choice that I make, and it's reflected in the work that I try to do. You know, I sincerely believe that entrepreneurs are the best hope that we have to address the issues around climate change, particularly around resilience and adaptation and mitigation. So I'm inspired by what I see. I'm inspired by students, and I think I'm inspired by the faculty who are really embracing this as an opportunity for kind of a new way to think about experiential education. I'm optimistic about the commitments that universities like NYU have made. I mean, you look at their investment in their cogen plant, and it really paid off big time for them during Hurricane Sandy, but it pays off the other 364 days during the year as well. So it's a choice, but I try to choose to be optimistic is the short answer.
So I probably, like a lot of people, I sort of fluctuate whether on some days I'm very optimistic and some days I'm very, it depends on what happened in the last election and things like that. I guess where I'm, the thing that keeps me optimistic is the capability for rapid change. And so what makes me think about this is something that's not an issue that's directly connected. It was actually mentioned at some point today, but conceptually I think it is, and that has to do with gay marriage. I'm the father of a young woman who had a lovely marriage to another young woman last year. And so I've sort of watched this issue evolve, and it seems to me there's a couple things that are that strike me about it. First is for someone of my age, it was inconceivable 10 years ago that we'd be at the point we are now. And that the fact that it seems like that the attitudes on that issue were changing incrementally until at some point they hit a threshold level, and then there was just a wave that washed it. So the fact that things can change so rapidly gives one hope. And the other part that I think is connected to the potential on these issues that we're talking about, the environmental issues, is that one of the reasons that things change, not the only reason, has to do with demographics and the demographics of the country and probably the demographics of the world. That it's, you know, I don't want to turn into simple black and white enemies and friends, but the people we've been talking about a lot today on the other side of a lot of these issues have a different demographic, and it's a demographic for which the youth of the country, to some degree, the change in that age group is not favorable, is not hopeful. So I think that in the same way that things changed on the gay issue, there's the potential for very rapid change. And you know, the people on the other side are very media savvy, and at some point, just like with gay marriage, they're going to jump over and say, we've always agreed with this. And try to co-opt the issue. But so that is, in my even most desperate moments, what keeps me feeling more optimistic about this.
The opportunity for a norm-casting moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, good way of phrasing it. Thank you.
Scott, you might use that.
You have to slide down, yeah.
Yeah, I'm optimistic too, for sure. It's the only way to be. And it's for two reasons. The people, and it's been touched on by the others, the people and the technology. Firstly, the people. Just from today, there's some smart minds in this arena, and you know, that fills me with hope. And in the newspaper article that was touched on initially this morning, I think as soon as we can start framing the issue around opportunity and entrepreneurship, that's when the real hope will come. And then obviously my background is technology, so from my angle, I'm positive from that side. I work with the WWF network, not just with Canada, and we watch what's happening in Africa with connectivity and mobility and access to people, and it's all positive, it's all going in the right direction. And I think the divergence, the coming together of those two things as well, with the demographics, younger people, technology being developed, they're going to come together and, I feel positive about that.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you all to sort of comment generally on key lesson from today, key thing that you've taken away from witnessing this conversation. Something that new that sort of occurred to you, or something that you think was missing from the conversation that's important. Ask you to comment on that.
I can say one.
We'll come back the other way. How about that? We'll start with Scott.
Oh, right, okay, right. Well, yeah, one quick observation.
Use your mic, Scott.
Lauren brought it up earlier. With this mobile environment that we're all operating in more and more, I feel it myself, there's this competing priorities on our time, there's distractions, there's multiple channels of information coming at us, and I think we've got to make things as simple as possible for people. That's a lesson learned that I've taken away. And Lauren was saying earlier about minimising clicks when you're online, making the process as easy as possible for people. And I can give an example from WWF with a review and redesign of our e-store. This is more on a fundraising side than a conservation side. But after a review and the subsequent redesign, we found that historically our e-store was 7 clicks to carry out a transaction, wasn't mobile optimised. We changed all that, it's now 2 clicks, it's optimised across all platforms, and from 2012 to 2013, mobile traffic's gone up 350%, revenue's gone up. So I think we have to make things as easy as possible for the target audience, and think about the environment that they're consuming the content that we're giving them.
Rich.
Hi. So, I'm not sure how new this is. It did make me think about it. I think as an academic, I think there's some things that academics are pretty good at and some things we're not particularly good at. We're pretty good at looking at an issue and finding a way to take a deep dive and figure out what's going on from a research point of view. And some of that material got presented or alluded to at various times today. We're not as good as making connections across a variety of different kinds of people and different kinds of ways of approaching things. So we talk about quite a lot about interdisciplinary work. It's talked about a lot more than it's done well. And so we try to do that, and I think the capstone class that made the presentations that you all saw during lunch was an attempt to cut across disciplines to some degree, to bring students from different areas together to do something. But one of the things I was thinking about in the last session is the people that were represented up here for that session are not the people that we're bringing in, because it's not a traditional academic perspective and viewpoint. But it's a really interesting one, and it's a way of capturing people's attention and making changes. So I think there's ways of making connections across different variety of perspectives, especially with the environmental movement that we still haven't tapped.
So I totally agree. Like, I think one of my big takeaways is just this feeling of disconnection, or at least that there's more. I think there's more opportunity to really engage, particularly with people who are close. I mean, some of the speakers today, despite the fact that I spent a lot of time wandering around, apparently, there's a lot of people here who I don't know, and I'm sure that a lot of you guys didn't know that we had this amazing clean economy incubator, like literally a stone's throw from here. I think there's that. The system justification theory stuff that you presented this morning was really interesting to me. And I'm not a social scientist, so I think these different kind of modes of thinking, of systems thinking in particular, to kind of move behavior change is really compelling. That being said, I do think there's a real risk of young people in particular disengaging with government, and particularly with policymakers. And I think if Obama comes out in favor of the Keystone XL pipeline, and I'm not sure, I missed kind of some of this afternoon, so I don't know if anyone talked about 350 or the movement around Keystone XL. But there's like people like me feel like big money has completely polluted politics, and that in the absence of any real national or international policy leadership, that like cities, in particular people who live in cities, are going to have to take the lead, right? We got to take up the flag because no one else is going to do it. And I think the real lesson, actually, and I'm thrilled that you're moderating the session, is that there are people who know this space in particular, like really, really well. They're all your people. Like Justin runs this amazing program called the NYC Media Lab. It's all the largest media companies in New York City and in the world, right? And you need those people kind of taking up the torch, because there's the reach, there's the sophistication, there's the familiarity with analytics, targeting, and the problem that we confront, I think, is that the smartest minds of my generation they're more focused on making people click on ads than they are about resilient infrastructure or clean water or sustainable agriculture or livable cities or any of that kind of stuff. And that is the scale of like what we confront.
Well, I want to come back to that too, because I think one of the things I wanted to ask is who's missing from this room, from this conversation generally, when you go back and forth to these types of events. But David.
So just a bit about my background. I was involved in elected politics as a candidate or an elected official for 20 years, and probably for a decade before that as a volunteer. So I'm used to dealing with people who have different opinions and try to help people to work together to reach a consensus, or if they can't reach a consensus, at least vote for me. So I found today fascinating, because your question was, what's the one thing you learned? And a lot of this, for me, gave me an intellectual framework for things I knew with my gut, but I didn't have the educational background. I apologize for this, but I'm an economist. That's what I studied. And so I thought some of this was very new to me in the way it was framed, particularly the justification. I'm sorry, I've forgotten already what it's called, but it made perfect sense of all of the climate denial and why it works. So it was quite a brilliant insight from my perspective. But I think the other thing, so that's the big learning for me. But related to that, and it's why I made my first comments, was the power of the smaller scale interventions that several speakers talked about, that were really about engaging people, one-on-one, in their own community. And I think that's critical. And it's critical for one of the reasons that Mika was talking about. Rates of participation in elections are declining. In case you didn't know, the US Supreme Court apparently ruled today that there are no limits on money at all in elections, because it's a matter of free speech that the richest people be able to subsidize all the candidates they want. I can comment on this because it's not Canadian politics. That's completely bizarre and a total deliberate misreading of your Constitution. But elections are critical, but that's sort of the base level. Democracy is really about people being engaged in the decisions about their communities on an everyday basis. And I think underlying all of this, although the big learning for me was the psychological research. It was so new I couldn't even spell psychological properly in my notes here. But underlying that is this connection to people, and I think that's the most powerful thing we talked about today, because it really works and has massive potential.
And do you share Micah's idea that cities will lead the change?
Of course, because when I was mayor, cities did lead the change. No, he's right, totally right. And I think if I anticipate your next question, because you just asked it, and I've got the mic, and you shouldn't give recovering politicians microphone. But why cities are leading the change is really simple. It's because cities are actually about delivering real change on the ground. That's what we do, whether it's social housing, in Toronto's case, public health, public transit, parks, economic programs. It's real change on the ground. So you're working with people every day, that's your job. And if my theory's right, that that's how we're going to win these environmental battles, is through really connecting people and giving them a chance to tell their own stories and participate in the way they want, cities are the only people who can do that. And so who's not here? There's not enough low-income people. And these issues are issues of social justice. And there's lots of reasons why these kinds of forums don't engage people in low-income communities, partly because they're usually working 2 or 3 part-time jobs. I think that's the biggest issue for the environmental movement. We saw glimpses of it today with people who are actually doing a good job engaging people from all backgrounds. But I think that's the biggest single issue. And we know that climate change, for example, is going to impact the poorest amongst us, both within United States and Canada and within the rest of the world. And those are people who need to be engaged in the conversation too. As we saw from the wonderful Sandy storytelling, they have a lot to say.
Rich, am I going to use, is it cities? Are cities going to be the answer?
Well, my understanding is that cities have been. I mean, that's where when the governments have refused to take any action, it's been local leaders that have actually gone out and done things and driven change. So, and for that reason, I think the people, first of all, I agree with what David said, and it's all too common in environmental discussions that you don't have people of color or people of lower income. And I think there's a lot of reasons for it, and certainly you named one. But I think the other group, the discipline that's not here, are policymakers and people that understand the intricacies of policy. Because at some point, when you've got to get these ideas actually put into law, either at a local or national level, you need to have people that understand those mechanisms and the levers to pull. And that's another group that we could clearly have.
So I would just say, like, I think that the people who are probably missing here today are the folks from the New York City tech community. So there was an article in the Times this morning that said that New York now employs about 330,000 people in tech. And sorry, you guys are probably from tech because I see your Techstars sticker on your laptop, which is awesome. But now there's as many people working in tech in New York as there are people working in finance. That is staggering. That is, that's
More media for that matter.
And so what that means is, like, New York Tech has arrived, and I think what I would like, to see is people who are serial entrepreneurs who are in the space, who've made their money from doing consumer web or enterprise or fintech, who now see opportunity in this space and can bring some of those skills around analytics, software engineering to bear to really catalyze movement. And the truth is, dominant platforms like Twitter and Facebook, there's a reason why they're banned all around the world. It's because they have toppled governments. And so to build a movement, you need those tools. And we've engaged with them. Like, we hosted 2 years ago. We hosted this Reinvent Green hackathon with the city of New York, and Twitter was there, right? They came with their APIs, and we had some data sets, and we had a ton of students building applications and sites, with that data. And I think that's exactly what we need, right? You need to take advantage of the existing reach of Facebook, Foursquare, Twitter, and build something ultimately that's really useful, that solves kind of big problems.
So I do want to get to some questions because we only have just a few minutes left between you and the cookies, apparently. So I'll take some questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
Well, just to speak to that, it seemed, I've been thinking about this for a while, and I'm not an app developer. I wish I was.
It's an integrated digital media program here at NYU.
Yeah, I know. I should consider that. Anyway, but it always seems to me that there's lots of people who want to change stuff in their own lives and also in their communities, and yet it's very hard to change something you can't measure. And if you have a basic sort of reflection of your own behavior or your community's behavior, it can be extremely useful in changing your own activity. And so I thought to myself, like, why don't we have something like a carbon counter, like something that would allow people to quickly, automatedly calculate their own carbon emissions, and that would be social media engaged and shareable, so that communities and people could sort of compare notes of how they're doing things. Like, in other words, like Facebook for carbon, but integrated into Facebook.
So that's a good, let me broaden the question and maybe ask also our technologists on quantified self. quantified community. Is that an answer? Is that the technological solution?
Well, maybe one of them, and there were discussions at lunchtime around that. I think it's just connecting the right people in the room with the great ideas. But yeah, and I think it's definitely one of the ways forward. It helps with that connectedness between people as well, where people are concerned.
And it changes behavior.
It changes behaviour, and it brings some competitiveness and some gamification to it as well. So yeah, it's fantastic. But those conversations are happening.
David has taken the mic.
Oh, what a shock. I've got a slightly different view. I think that's a good thing, and if you can get it to be gamified, and Scott can talk about what WWF's doing in South Africa, which is really interesting. But I'm not sure that on its own is going to engage people for the reasons that we heard earlier about the basic psychology. It's useful. What I feel far more useful and more engaging, because it connects emotionally, is the work done to document what happened in Hurricane Sandy. Because that is climate change. It's not what might happen when the climate changes. It is climate change. That's the latest statement from the World Meteorological Institute. The storms we're seeing are climate change. And I think those pictures and stories are emotional, they're compelling. And they send the message, we've got to act collectively, not just individually. Second point I'd make on that, on the issue of climate change, and parenthetically I'd say climate change has sort of sucked the entire energy of the environmental movement, because there are lots of other environmental issues, right, like the health of our fresh water systems. But on the issue of climate change, it is so overwhelming, even to people who agree with the science, that we find a lot in Canada, I don't know what it's like here, people saying, I can't do anything more, I've changed all my light bulbs, I'm driving a Prius, I'm taking public transit, I'm walking to work. You know what, I'm not going to ride my bicycle with my son's hockey equipment when it's 40 below zero, I'm sorry. I'm driving my minivan. And there's a sense of giving up. So I think the messages need to be nuanced. I think exactly what you've said has a place, very important place, but without the kind of emotional attachment, I don't think we're going to move people's behavior like we need to.
Okay. Another question, and maybe if you could frame your question in terms of something you've learned today or something you're surprised by. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, I mean, is there room for like more of a positive vision? Because I mean, we do have a frame of doom and gloom, and I think about it in terms of like reaching out to people, like in terms of like economics, like the Green New Deal, like what does it take to transform the country? How many jobs does this create, et cetera, et cetera? And I mean, I do feel like that's been kind of missing from this conversation. I mean, do you guys have like visions about that, or like?
Only after a few scotches.
Back in the back there.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something in relationship to that, is that my father, who I adore, and I'm very proud of, has recently transitioned from working for the VA, Veterans Administration, for the U.S. government, to being an environmental justice minister in the Bay Area, working with 350.org and a slew of other different organizations. And he went through the, process of grief and, leading through the process, kind of, I forget the term. But he's come to this point of acceptance, and even beyond that, he's come to this point where he's really excited about the possibilities now of kind of really building there's now an opportunity for coming together that there hasn't been since the 60s, because there's so much overlap, and just don't need to be silos. And so I think one of our biggest challenges and opportunities is like really finding those meaningful ways of working together, because these are interrelated issues. And there is a lot of opportunity right now through these tools and through the interrelationship.
Yep, so I agree with that. I just want to come back to your point, because it was a fair point, right? So I don't know about a Green New Deal, but I will use the example of the proliferation of farmers markets in the U.S., which I don't know exactly what the percentage is, but they have grown in the double digits year over year. And what that says is that people want a relationship with people who are growing their food. So I think that's cause for some optimism. And I think that there are stories that you can tell, and there are stories like in our incubator program, of companies creating jobs and doing some really compelling things, kind of turning innovation into impact. Again, I'm a New Yorker, I'm a realist. The truth of the matter is, we are a ways away from a clean energy economy, primarily because natural gas is really cheap. And as long as you have cheap natural gas, it's going to make the existing fossil energy system that all of this is completely dependent on, it's here to stay for the next several decades at least. I mean, and the tar sands, the Canadian tar sands, it's a reflection of that central issue. But basically, cheap fossil fuels underlie everything else across our economy and our society, from the clothes that we wear, to the food that we eat, to the way that we get to and from our jobs, to how we heat and power our homes. So I don't think, again, from a national perspective, I don't think that the president has the wherewithal to push through a Green New Deal. I think what he's done is he's kind of picked his battles, and I think right now he's kind of using the EPA to put forward some kind of legacy. But I don't think there's going to be any national movement on
led from the top.
That's right, on a quote unquote Green New Deal, right? On putting people back to work through green jobs. I mean, the truth is, he got kind of burned on that. Was 4 years ago. So it was like overpromised and kind of underdelivered. That being said, I think the advanced energy economy came out with some data that said that what they call the advanced energy economy is actually growing at twice the rate of the the national economy, and that now advanced energy is like an $8 trillion opportunity globally. So there's absolutely money to be made. There's good stories to be had. You don't have to look much farther than Tesla or Solar City, which are performing incredibly well, which are launching new products and new services, employing people. Like, there are really great stories out there. It's just that, there's this Solyndra hangover. Clean tech was really tossed around as a dirty word during the last election. And I think there's some reticence around people, particularly again at the national level, being overly ambitious and linking economic growth with green energy or sustainability or what have you.
I just wanted to add a note that one of the things that's interesting about green markets, at least in New York City, is they were started by a guy named Barry Benby about 30 years ago, not in order to bring local food to consumers here. His goal, and he had written a thesis on this, was how to keep farmers in the tri-state region from going out of business and having to sell off to subdivisions. So the thesis said what we need to do is provide better markets for the farmers, and that'll keep them in business, and we'll have local farmers. And maybe that I think is an interesting story in itself, but it also, I think, fits with a lot of the things to say today, which is a lot of the solutions are going to be these small-scale, bottom-up solutions that grow, because the markets have done a lot of things, including jobs and economics.
I just want to chip in to say that I agree with you completely. We need positive visions. And isn't it interesting that we've fallen into the negative after hearing everything else all day and about how that doesn't really work and doesn't motivate people and doesn't produce change, and we fell right back into it. I think you're completely right. Personally, I think the ones that are going to work are more the ones that touch people directly, like the farmers markets and the student project, if you saw it about the chef from Toronto who's come to the Waldorf Astoria and has hives and makes his own honey on top of the roof of the Waldorf Astoria.
Chef from Toronto.
Yes, from Toronto, Canada. I think those kinds of things that connect with real people in real ways in their real lives are a bit more persuasive than the esoteric idea of jobs, unless they're actually working in the industries. But you're dead on. We've got to start talking positively. It's about creating cities and communities where people really want to live. They're exciting, vibrant, beautiful places to live and healthy. And that's a great story that people can get on board with.
So we've almost run out of time. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative, and I'll ask you to ask your question maybe afterwards if you don't mind. And just ask, there's a lot of students in the room. What's the one last thing you would leave them with? What's the thing they should be doing in their studies, in their career, as they make decisions? We've got one gentleman who's applying to the Integrated Digital Media Program. What should he do? What should he do?
I actually think people should volunteer on political campaigns. and then stay involved after the campaign with all the people they meet and build broader networks in the community so we can actually make the kind of change we're talking about. You can't underestimate what it means to elect somebody who shares your values and actually implements them when they get elected. It reinforces everything and creates incredible energy, positive energy. But the key to that is not just to volunteer, it's to stay involved and keep people involved in between elections. That's what makes real change, in my view.
All right, well,
I'm a politician.
I know.
The class is empty.
Politicians.
I would, so I think interning is great. I'd say actually go intern with a startup. If you're interested, go intern with one of the startups in the incubator program. Or, make a list of 5 or 10 companies who you think are doing some really cool things. And they exist here in New York City, right? There are companies that are big, like Recycle Bank. And then we have 15 startups in the incubator that's literally a stone's throw from here. You will learn more than you could ever dream possible. You will have accountability. You'll get your hands dirty. You might find that it's for you, or you might find that you hate it and you want to go work for a big company. But I guarantee you that if you do want to go work for a big company when you graduate, that having that experience of having interned for a startup will make you that much more valuable.
Yeah, yes, definitely internship's a great thing. I think for me, I stay positive, and if you have got a technical bias to the direction you're going in, I would say be targeted, find a problem that needs a solution, and work on developing something for that, something like you were saying earlier. But try not to be too broad in your approach. If you find something specific, find a need, and see if you can work on a solution for that.
I actually don't have anything all terribly original to add to any of those. I think there used to be something really boringly called service learning, where people in universities would essentially take their skills and go out and donate them and learn from doing it. And then also, if you knew how to do web design and find some organization that they can't afford web design, then you create something for them, or in whatever field. But I think finding some organization that you care about to get tied in with them, and then orient your learning experiences around what they do is a great way to connect yourself.
All right, so there you have it. The politician has recommended politics. The startup guy has recommended startups. The tech guy has recommended finding a problem and coming up with a tech solution, and the professor suggested a sort of learning approach to solving problems. But I want to thank you all. Thank you very much, Chris. I don't know if you have something else to say. I think the day is closed. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much. There are some form of sweets around the corner, and we hope you'll stay.